thank you for doing that. I'm very grateful. I know we've had a lot of questions already, but let me ask you a question. If we could go to my second slide. How many of us love Marmite? Oh, actually, there's a few. Okay, so how many of us really hate Marmite? Yeah, more of you. Yeah, I thought that would be the case. Marmite is this hate it or love it kind of thing, isn't it? It's a really strange thing. And I believe that Marmite is a little bit like the book of Revelation. When you think about it, Marmite is that sticky brown paste. It's made from concentrated yeast extract. Those of us who love it really do. Those of us who hate it really do hate it. And I think that's how people view this book of Revelation. They either love it and they dive into it and mine it for every minutiae. Who's the Antichrist? When's Jesus going to return? I noticed that probably about 2 months ago, before there was something in the heavens. I'm not into what goes on in the skies. It's just not my thing. But I think there was a big meteorite or something. And there was some signs. I saw photographs of people saying, Jesus is going to return this week. I can tell you this, they got it wrong. Because he didn't. But there's always these people that love that, get really into it, and then there are those that think, whoa, this is a dodgy book. This just does not make sense to me. There's all these funny creatures flying around. It's just awful. Earthquakes, I'm just not going to touch it. There's 65 other books in the Bible. Even Leviticus is better than Revelation, right? So people avoid it like the plague. And I have to confess, that's been my approach for quite a long time, until quite recently, when I just felt really challenged by the Lord to delve back into this book and to explore it a little bit and to try and see what God might be saying to me and hopefully to us through its pages. Because it is in the Bible. It's there for a purpose. And just like every other book in the Bible, the Holy Spirit uses those words to speak to us, doesn't he? He wants to speak to us through this book. And I'm hopeful that this morning, as we look at the book of, or at least touch on, and it is only just a touch on the book of Revelation, we'll be able to get a little bit of a handle of God just speaking into our lives today for today. So I want to just start really by thinking about John, the apostle who wrote this book. He's on the island of Patmos. If you have my next slide. So Patmos, on the left-hand side of the picture. So this is basically Turkey, right? How many people have been to Turkey on holiday? Anyone? Okay, so you've been to Turkey. I've yet to go. But Patmos is a little island. Just on the left-hand side, there's Ephesus. Just on the tiny little island down there. And you can see on the big picture up there, Asia Minor, that's Turkey. You can see, you can just make out, I'm sure, that there are 7 churches there, 7 congregations. That's where they were based, in Turkey. And John, the book of Revelation is a letter. It's a letter that he's writing to those 7 churches that he was familiar with and he knew. And he was writing from this island of Patmos. Now, the first thing I want to say about this is John was not on Patmos for a holiday. Okay, probably you're aware of that. But he didn't go to Patmos because he fancied a bit of sun. He was there because the Roman authorities had taken umbrage with him and particularly with what he was saying about Jesus Christ. And so they exiled him to this island. It was persecution, which, as I think we prayed someone a little bit earlier, we must recognize that around our world, there are so many brothers and sisters who are persecuted and sometimes lose their life just for doing what we're doing this morning, seeking to worship Jesus in a congregation. Well, that's what John was doing. That was how he lived, that was his life. And the churches that he wrote to, ordinary congregations, just like you, just like Jubilee Church in Bromley Common, just small congregations, John was writing a letter to them, and their part of their lived experience was they lived in a world where they were being persecuted for what they believed. None of these congregations would have been big. None of them would have had a huge amount of power and influence. They were cogs, as individuals and as small churches, in a very huge Roman machine. that despite the pretenses of Pax Romana, did not really bring peace. The people who lived in those cities and who formed part of the churches were part of a conquered nation. They were subject to the whims of the Romans in power. They had very little ability to do anything other than be squeezed into a Roman mould of life. And just to put that into context a bit more, what that meant for them was that as good Roman citizens, they would have had to have recognised that in amongst all the gods that were in the world, Caesar was the god. And they would have been required to have, as part of their lifestyle, worshipped Caesar. That was part and parcel of Roman life. That was been an expectation. And I'm quite sure you can recognise, as I do, that that would have been a little bit of a problem to start with for anyone who genuinely loves Jesus. Because for those like John who resisted that pressure to conform, there really was the reality that they could be carted off to exile or worse. And when those members, sitting in their congregations, worshipping the Jesus that they'd been taught and who they'd met and encountered, when they looked around, they must have felt very powerless. As though, really, what hope do we have in a world that's dominated by this empire that tells us what to do, that at a whim can cart us off to an island in exile or put us on a cross? They would have been powerless. And into this situation, John writes. And interestingly, I think it's interesting, when this would have been read to them, they would have had the whole 22 chapters read to them. That's what would have happened. Somebody would have arrived with the letter, they would have stood up, and they would have read this letter from John. All 22 chapters. And he starts off, as we heard earlier, John's writing to the 7 churches. And he's writing to them because he wants to encourage them, and he wants to make them think, and he wants to draw them into a closer relationship with Jesus. And in fact, how I kind of look at this, what I kind of think of it is, what John is trying to do is, if you think of a stage, a really big stage with curtains across, that maybe only just fractionally open, people at the front can kind of peer through and see some of what's going on, but you wouldn't be able to see everything, would you? But what John is doing in this book, in this letter to the churches, is he's pulling the curtains back. The word revelation comes from the Greek apocalypse, which means opening or unveiling. So he's unveiling something to these churches. He's trying to help them see what's really going on. Now, I'm sure many of you aren't as old as me, but there might have been one or two of you around in the 80s. And if you were, do you remember there was an advert on the television by The Guardian? And the advert went something like this. There was a scene of a very respectable, good, well-to-do gentleman walking along a road in a business suit with a case. And the camera pans back just a little, and you get to see a skinhead come yob just down the road from him, who turns, sees this respectable gentleman walking along the road, and his face kind of screws up, and this lad starts running at a pace at this gentleman, this older gentleman that's walking along the road. And the older gentleman looks up, sees this youth running at him, clutches his bag, and there's fear on his face. And the whole impression of this advert is, whoa, this is not good. This yob is about to mug this poor gentleman. This is obviously a story about youth violence and this is what this is going to be about. Until the camera pans back further. Anyone remember this? Yeah, one or two of you. The camera pans back, and all of a sudden, what you actually see is that the man is walking under some scaffolding. Now, we'll leave aside the kind of health and safety issues that this brings up right now, but the scaffolding was falling down, and in fact, this yob, far from attacking the man, was actually trying to save him by pushing him physically out of the way from danger. And all of a sudden, as those curtains pulled back and in the camera, you got the whole picture. Now, I'm not defending The Guardian, by the way. Let me cards on table before anyone gets worried. No? Okay, perhaps you're all Guardian readers, so perhaps that's okay. But all right, the advert's a really powerful picture of what John is trying to do. He's trying to give his congregations the whole picture. Revelation is John trying to say, this is what's really going on, and what is going on. Can I have my next slide? Someone talked about holidays, picture holidays. Here are mine. You're going to get 2 from last year. Claire and I went to Florence in Italy, and we had a wonderful time. This is a street, and I tell you what, I love Florence. I'd go back there at a drop of a hat. I really enjoyed it. But when it's hot, and you're in a street like that that's absolutely rammed, and the buildings are pretty tall, you don't get to see very much. It all looks, pretty hard work. But if you climb up a tower or 2, you get to see the next slide. And you suddenly get to see a wonderful overview of a wonderful city, including that wonderful cathedral. You get to see a bigger picture. I'm ramming the point home today. But this is what Revelation is doing. It's saying, have a look at the bigger picture. And what is the bigger picture? What is it that John wanted? Well, there's lots that John wanted to say, but we really haven't got time to get into it all. But what I do want to say is this, and just make a few points about what he was bringing, showing this group of people who were under Rome's rule, who were oppressed, who were going to find life very difficult, being challenged about who they were going to worship. John says, I was in the Spirit and I was taken into heaven. And what do I see? What did he see? He saw a throne, didn't he? He saw a throne of power and authority. And who was sitting on the throne? Was it Caesar? No, thank you. No, it absolutely wasn't Caesar. It was God. In fact, it was the Lamb who was slain before the foundation of the world. The one that John shared, the picture that he shared was, the Lamb's on the throne. The Lamb's on the throne, not Caesar. Not some petty little God that's demanding you worship him or her. Jesus is on the throne. And your world might be being turned upside down. You might be threatened with exile, but the Lamb is on the throne. And I just wonder, if I let my imagination go, just what that would have meant to someone like you or I sitting in the middle of Turkey in a town or a village where I was just one of maybe 30 or 40 or 50 people, and everyone else thought I was nuts. Everyone else actually hated me because I worship this funny God called Jesus, who's not God anyway, because Caesar's God. And in fact, if I went talking about Jesus, then actually they didn't like me and they might arrest me. I wonder what that message would have done to them. I think, for me, what it had done would have gone, yes, this makes a difference. This makes a difference to my life, because the reality is Caesar is not on the throne. He thinks he is, but the reality is God is. And that God, and many of these who got the letter would have been Jews, this God, and this is my link back to Isaiah, would have been incredibly familiar with that passage in Isaiah and countless others where God is described sitting on a throne, in charge, having everything in his hands. How's your world today? Do you feel like God's got everything in his hands? When you look around at the darkness that we seem to be plunging in, the anger, the aggression, the violence, the arguments, the bitterness, the polarization that I see on my television screens, and that's just the news, every night, doesn't it make you feel, or I'm the only one, God, where are you? How many people are despondent, according to the polls? Lots, with what they see in our politicians. Who's going to help us? I wonder if some of us have got health issues or family issues, that how is this ever going to work out? I've got issues and challenges right now that I'm struggling with, that I don't have an easy answer to. I've got 1 or 2 health issues that are not great. people far worse than me, but there are things that are really niggling that have gone on for quite a long time that I'm getting really fed up with. God, where are... God's on the throne. And it does change something. It does for me, I don't know about you, but it makes me feel, great, I've got some hope. I have some hope. And that's what I believe John's letter would have done. And it's more than just thinking differently. Because John's challenge would have been, and if you read it through, is to live differently. Don't just let it affect what you think. Let what you think change how you live, how it impacts your life. Church, how are we living our lives? Are we just cogs? Can we make a difference? Do we feel powerless? It's not true. The same Spirit, says Paul, who raised Jesus from the dead, dwells where? Any of you know? In us. The same Spirit that raised Jesus from the dead, that took a dead man as in 3 days in a grave dead, raised him to life. That Spirit dwells in here and dwells in you. We are not powerless. We are not left without hope. Jesus makes a difference in our lives, in how we live. And I just want to wrap this up in 3 ways. Paul talks in Corinthians 13 about the 3 things that are eternal: faith, hope, and love. Faith gives us confidence that God has us in his hands. When you read Revelation chapter 1, the first thing you'll notice, we only touched on it really, is that John sees a picture of Jesus walking amongst 7 lampstands. And he goes on to say, the 7 lampstands are you, the church, is. If you read it. So it's very clear that what the picture is saying is, in the midst of what's going on, Jesus is with you. And I have faith in a Jesus that's with me. Sometimes I feel him and sense his presence really close. Other times I don't. Sometimes Jesus seems a million miles away. But I have faith. And I sink my feet in faith that Jesus is with me today. And he's with you too. I'm no different. I'm no special. I'm not special. He's promised to be with us. Jesus has promised to be amongst us. He's here today. Paul calls us to have faith in the truth of what God says. He calls us to have hope about our future. Jesus is on the throne. When John wrote this and the churches listened, historically speaking, there was at least another 200 years before Constantine became a Christian, over 200 years. And in that next 200 years, the persecution was going to ramp up and increase, if you know your church history. Many, many, many people died for their faith in those next 200 years. They could well have thought, what are you talking about? God's on the throne. I'm dying, literally here. But it gave them hope that allowed them to say, actually, yeah, I'm going to die for this. Because God's on the throne. And I don't know how or when, but he's going to come through. Jesus is going to return. I have hope and I can live for that. And then lastly, Paul talks about love. In fact, he says love is the most important aspect. And we live out our lives with love in the light of our faith and our hope. Jesus said you should love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, which is the easy bit, actually, I think. It's very easy to love Jesus. Very easy to worship him. But he went on, and I almost want to say, unfortunately, because it's the challenge, and love your neighbour as yourself. Love your neighbour as yourself. And who is your neighbour? Who is mine? One of the reasons I started with Cap and the story of Cap is to tell you that there are 45 neighbours that I've had the privilege of loving. Now, what I do actually is I don't do any of the hard work. I sit in the back, I do a bit of organisation, I meet Martin Pointing, our debt centre manager, and I encourage him, pray with him and send him back out to do the real work. He and his team do all the real work. But I have played a part because I've been able to love my neighbours. And the reason I do CAP, and a number of other things actually, is because it's an expression of my faith. So I want to see God's kingdom come in this world that seems to be so dark, there is a God that loves us, that cares for us, and wants to make a difference. I will put up my last slide, if you would, please. No, sorry, next one. Yeah, sorry, one of my favourite films. This is a quote from, with a few pictures, holiday pictures from Florence last year. But what we do in life echoes in eternity. It's not in the Bible. Maximus said it in a famous film. But I think that's absolutely true. What you do, what I do in life will echo in eternity. How are we living? How are we living our lives? Is it in the light of the fact that Jesus is on the throne, that he's coming back, and he calls us to follow him and live lives that are pointing to that reality? Because, church, that is the reality, whatever it might look like here and now. Amen.